Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. Now we come to the topic that probably many of you have been waiting for patiently and with bated breath. We're going to talk about how we can access non-container schemas that are outside of our project. So, as I said, for many of you, this is probably one of your primary use cases. You've got a BW or an ERP system, and you want to build some reporting on top of that. You want to build some calculation views. You basically extend on top of it. The tables and the data in those tables, that's all managed by the other packaged application in a separate schema in the HANA database. It's not part of your project. Now, this is a major area of change as we move to HANA deployment infrastructure and the Web IDE for SAP HANA, because in the old environment, you could just create a calculation view and you could see every table of view in the system, and you could just drag them in and use them. So it didn't matter that that table was from the ERP system. You could just add it to your calculation view. But part of the problems that we talked about early on in this video series, long migrations into production for complicated calculation views, long activation times, partial activation, and I talked about how HDI, or the HANA deployment infrastructure, tries to solve those problems through several different approaches, some of them technical, just rewriting things behind the scenes. But one of the other major changes that it makes is this idea that everything within a container has to be private to that container. There's no global object access anymore. So I can't just go grab a table from an existing schema. I have to first create a synonym to it. And the synonym will exist inside my container, and it's my local object that I can reference, and it's sort of like a remote pointer or an alias to the object in another synonym. And that has a couple of purposes. By having synonyms, now we have a very set usage pattern. We know exactly what we use outside of our container. We don't have to worry that there's infinite number of external dependencies. We know exactly what dependencies we have, and we can scan and find them very quickly by just looking at synonyms. Because if you try to access anything that you don't have a synonym for, you're just going to get an error message that the object doesn't exist. So that's one thing. It creates a clear, documented, almost API-like layer so that we know exactly what's using what. And even from the consumption side, if I was in the ERP schema, I could know exactly which calculation views use a particular table because I could trace back through the synonyms. So it becomes almost like a documentation, or as I said, an API-like approach. And the other thing that this does is it supports the concept of branching, of having different versions of views that point to the same objects at the same time, but don't override each other. If all of our references are local to our container, then the synonyms themselves become an abstraction layer, an alias, and gets rid of the need for things like name mapping. We had in the old repository for calculation views, when you move from one system to another, often the target schema name changes. So if it's an ERP system, it's usually like SID, SAP, and then the SID, the system ID of the system. And those system IDs are going to be different in Dev, QA, Prod. But of course, if you create a calculation view in Dev and it references a particular schema, well, that would break then when you move it to QA or Prod. We came up with the concept of schema mapping, but this was specific to calculation views. It was a solution that it only worked for calculation views and allowed you to create a mapping table that would dynamically change the schema references inside the calculation view. By using synonyms for that schema access, we have that same sort of mapping capability because we can dynamically supply the target schema name at deploy time. But now synonyms are something that can be used by any database artifact, not just calculation views. So we really open up the concept of schema mapping to all of our development objects. Our stored procedures, even our SQL statements that we issue can now all be schema mapped as well. So really we take some of the solutions that we had in the old environment that only worked for calculation views, and we extend them out. We create a more robust, a more secure environment by not having always global access, and we get better deployment. No partial activations, no long activation runtimes. We can technically improve the migration process through this change as well. But what it does mean is this is a more complicated design time process. So the development process, it was very easy in the old world to just drag in your table into your calculation view. But now there are steps that we're going to have to do to prepare that table in that foreign schema for usage in our own project. We're going to have to not just create the synonym, but also, because our technical users only have rights to the objects that are in our container, in our project, they're not automatically going to be able to see those foreign schemas. So we're going to have some mechanism to also grant access to our technical users. And we don't want that to be a manual process. In the old repository, if you did this with sysrepo, one of the things you had to do is you had to manually grant access from the foreign container, the foreign schema, to sysrepo. Otherwise, when you imported your delivery units, they would just fail because sysrepo would not have access. We wanted to make sure that that manual process that you had to do before could be automated and part of the transport process. So that means at design time, as part of our project, not only are we defining the synonyms, but we're also defining the way to grant security to our technical user, so it can be a fully automated process to deploy this into production. And that's simply, today with calculation views in the old repository in the HANA Studio, that cannot be totally automated with delivery units alone. But in this new environment with the Web IDE and the HANA deployment infrastructure, it can be. So it may feel a bit more complicated at first. There are certainly new steps here, there's new development artifacts, but really once you learn the process and kind of get comfortable with the new concepts, you'll find that we've shifted some of the work, but it's made for less work on the back end, less work from an administrative standpoint, and less manual effort to migrate content between systems. And that's an overall improvement, I think. And what we've done here is I don't have a full ERP system on my HANA. That's just a lot of data to load and a lot of extra work. And particularly, I want you to be able to follow along with the exercises as well. So what we have is we have Sflight. And if you've worked in the ABAP world, you're probably familiar with Sflight. It is a series of educational tables back 20 plus years ago when I first started learning ABAP. We used the Sflight tables in all of the educational materials and the classroom training. So what we've done here is Sflight is available on the internet. You can download it for free, and you can load it into your HANA system. So the export files for Sflight are available. Anybody can load it in the system. It's not terribly big. It's like 60, 70 megabytes. So it's enough data to be interesting, but not so much that you can't load it into your own private HANA instance in the cloud or on HANA Express on your laptop. And it's got, just like the name implies, it's flights, it's airlines. So we can see flight data, bookings. So customers book seats on flights, and then we have airplanes, master data about airplanes inside here, and we have flight plans and meals, and there's lots of interesting data in here. It's not ERP specific. You don't have to know anything about ERP or sales orders or purchase orders. We've all probably flown on a plane at some point, or we understand, you book a plane, it takes you from city to city. So this is a pretty easy model to understand. But more importantly, I've loaded this into my system. I'll put a link in the show notes on where you can go to get this and how to load it into your own system. And once you have it there, technically it works just like an ERP system. It's its own separate schema named Sflight. Now the ERP schema would be named SAP SID, the SID of the system, and then it would have all the ERP tables in it, including the Sflight tables. But although the name is different, the way we access it, the technical way we interact with it from the Web IDE, all of that is exactly the same. So it's a great approach to have a smaller system, an easier to load system than a full ERP system, but everything of the way that we're going to use this is exactly the same that you would use if you had an ERP or a BW system on HANA and you wanted to use it inside of your project. So what we need to do is we need to start this process of connecting to this Sflight schema and setting up the security as I described for our technical user. And it used to be that this was a really manual process. You had to create the grants files, and we're going to need what we call a user provided service, basically a way of defining the technical user that is part of that other schema that will grant access to our technical users. This whole process that I described, at deploy time that can be automated, and the key technology that makes that possible is a user-provided service. And of course, an admin can set up the user-provided service in advance, and probably in a production system, you would have that. A security admin or a basis DBA admin would probably set that up in advance. But in the development environment, the developer can do all this, and they can actually do it all in one step from the Web IDE. We've added a nice little wizard to try to simplify this process, because originally it was too many manual steps and you had to go over to the admin tools and do part of it and then come back to the Web IDE and do another part. But we've added this wizard that when I right mouse click on the DB module, a HANA database module, and under modeling I see add external SAP HANA service. And this is going to do most of the work for us. And we have our choice of, well, do I want to connect to a non-HDI container? That would be the case if it's a traditional schema, an ERP, a BW system. Or do I want to connect to another HDI container? Now we'll come back and we'll do that other option in the next video. But for now, let's start with the non-HDI container. And if somebody has already pre-created your user-provided service for you, you can just connect to it and let the wizard also, generate all the other code for you. But almost more importantly, you can also create the user-provided service from here. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to say cross schema sflight 00. Now, you actually don't need to put in the host and the port anymore on a user-provided service. It will automatically use the main connection to the HANA database. It will assume that you're wanting to use the HANA database that you're sitting on top of, because that's actually the only choice you have. You can't connect to another database using this approach. But a user-provided service, the technology we're used here, can be used for different things. We're going to use it later in this video series to also connect to external websites. That's why he's asking us for a username, for a host name and port. We don't actually need it anymore, but the wizard still requires it to be input. That's something that hopefully we'll fix in the near future. It's a recent addition that we actually didn't need to supply it in the user-provided service as well. But the key here, I'm just going to say local host, so it's going to connect to its local system. But the key here sometimes is the port. The port is important because this is the instance number of the HANA system, 00. That's how my HANA system is installed. You may have to adjust that for your instance number. And the number here, 15, this is the SQL port for my tenant. And if you have multiple tenants on your system, you may have to change this number to point to the particular tenant that you want to hit. that's where it's nicer if we wouldn't have to supply the hostname and port, and it would automatically connect based upon the project settings, the default tenant for the space that we're in. But for now, we'll go ahead and we'll put this in. I'm connecting to the first tenant in my system, and that's always going to be number 15. And if you have multiple tenants in the system, you may have to ask your system admin what port that they're running on. All right, this is really the most important part here, though, is the username and password. So what we're doing here is I'm supplying a username and password, and this is the user that will be used at deploy time to actually perform the grants. So this user has to have the roles or the security with grant option that we want to give to our technical user. It will actually be this user ID, not our user ID, not the technical user, not sysrepo, but it's this user that will perform the grants to our technical user to give them access to Sflight or the ERP schema or whatever you would be doing here. So this is a user, this is a powerful user that you probably don't want to just use one that has like access to everything. You want to create them for your specific scenarios so that they only have access to a small subset of the tables or views in the other schema that you want to use in your particular project. And this is something that a security admin should set up in advance, and they're going to control the access that way, because I can't just give my technical user access to any table, like I could in the old environment. I can only give them access to the tables that this user ID has access to. So it becomes a gateway, a security control mechanism that the developer themselves can't choose just whatever they want. They can only choose what they've been given access to indirectly via what this user has access to. So I will go ahead and say OK. And what that wizard did is it created the user provided service for me, and it we could come over here to the admin tools and see that just to verify that it really did its job. So if I come into my development space and I come here to services, user provided service, we see that it just created that user provided service for me. So I didn't have to come over to the admin tools and do that. I only came here to prove to you that it did it. So that's nice. The wizard didn't make us leave the web IDE to do that, but almost more importantly, it also edited our MTA YAML, and it added it as a resource in my MTA YAML, and it came here to the modules, and it already added it as a require statement to my database module. I didn't have to do any of that. In the old days, when we first introduced the web IDE, this was all manual steps. You had to create the service, then you had to add it as a resource, and then add it as a requires to your module. We don't have to do any of that now. The wizard took care of all of it for us. It's good. It's ready to go. Now, the only thing we do need to do is now we have to write the little rules that will be applied at deploy time to say specifically what we want to have given access to our technical user of our container. And we do that in a separate folder, separate from the source folder. There's another specialized folder that can be in the root of a database module, and that's the CFG, or configuration folder. And this is where we put any configuration rules, little scripts, if you will, that will happen at deploy time before the deployment of any artifacts in the source folder. And that's an important distinction. We're saying do all the security setup before you try to deploy anything. That way we know that things happen in the right order. And what I want to do is add to this config folder, I want to add a new file, and I'm going to add Sflight HDB grants. Okay? And HDB grants is a separate development artifact used specifically, almost like I said, almost like a configuration script that will run at deploy time before all the artifacts are created or altered. And the syntax of it is basically the same syntax as a role, an HDB role, or very similar to a role. It uses a JSON-based syntax. But let's go ahead and let's grab that here, and then we'll talk about it. X212. So what the syntax is doing is it's saying use this service. So service name 1, that's the alias that was created here um, in the resource. If we see this this service name 1, there it is, service name 1. We've set up an alias. The wizard did this for us. It set up this alias for our service because we don't want to hard code the actual service name. We could do that. Physically, we could take the actual service name, cross schema Sflight 00, and we could put it here, but then that wouldn't be very transportable because maybe we use a different service name in each system, or maybe when a different developer checks out this project, maybe they're using a different service name. We don't want to have to go through and change all our artifacts, so we use an alias for the service that was set up in the MTA YAML so that we never have to change our development artifacts. But we're basically saying use that service and whatever username and password is embedded in that service, and then grant something to our technical users. And here, once again, remember in the last video, I talked about how we technically have two different technical users. We have an object owner technical user, and we have an application user technical user. This is the one that's going to be used to create artifacts at deploy time, and it's going to be the owner. That's why it says owner. So technically the SQL owner of the database artifacts. And then at runtime, when we perform SQL against the container, it's actually a different technical user that will be used. And sometimes that might mean you want to give them different levels of access. Maybe I want to give less security to my execution user, my application user, than I want my owner. In this scenario, we don't need to give them different access. And although I can come here and specifically state the access, I could say give it this table, give it select on this table, and update on that table. What we've done here is I'm referencing a role, an existing database catalog role that is part of the Sflight schema. And this way, if the security needs to be changed, I don't have to come into the grants and specifically change it. I could just change the role. And then because that role is assigned to my technical user, the security is automatically changed. So it gives us better maintenance over time. So we recommend that you only grant via roles and not specific accesses. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And if I were to build at this point, it would use the user provided service to grant access to my technical user. In fact, let's just go ahead and do a build. We can see that even before we go on and utilize this. So if I do a build of the database module, we'll give it a second here. You can see that once it's done, that we have some extra stuff that's going on here. What we see is using grantor service name 1 of type SQL, and it's processing the HTTP grants. Okay, so that means that it's used whatever we specified in the HTTP grants to assign this role to our technical user. So now our technical user has select access to the Sflight schema. So now we can create some synonyms. If we tried to create the synonyms before without the grants, when we tried to build, we would have gotten either a not authorized or object does not exist kind of error. But now the security is set up so that we're ready to create the synonyms. So let's just come here back over to our source folder, and let's just go into data, and let's create a new database artifact. Let's call it Sflight, and it's a type of a synonym, and we'll say create, and this opens the synonym editor. We could also do this directly using the code editor, and then it would be a JSON formatted file. But let's use the nice little form-based editor that we have here. So that we can just click the add, and we can type them in if you want. We can just say, I want the table, we want a synonym named Sflight, I want the target object name to be Sflight and the target schema to be Sflight. So that's the table named Sflight in the schema Sflight. And the synonym name does not have to be the same. I could give it a completely different name, but it kind of, if you're already familiar with the foreign objects, then giving it the same name as a synonym just makes it easier to know what you're pointing to there. Okay. We could have also come here. If I were to give it a name, say SBook, I could use the value help if I wanted, and I tell it which user provided service to use to do the search. And then, for instance, here if I say I want to connect to SBook, then it does a search and it finds the table for me. If you want to make sure that you got the name right, you can do that. It's just as fast if you know the names, like I do here, to type them in, so you don't have to use the value help if you don't want. SPFLI, and it's also in Sflight. So we're basically going to get access, GHT, we're going to get access to 3 tables: the Sflight table, the SBook table, and the SPFLI table. Okay, and we'll go ahead and save that. We can build once again at this point. You don't have to do the builds at each point. I could have waited to do one build until the end. That would have worked as well. I'm just kind of doing this so I can show you incrementally what each thing is doing. So we'll see here, once it's done, that we have our synonyms being created. And now if I come back over to the Database Explorer and I come to the core DB, my container, and now if I look in synonyms, now for just those 3 tables that I created synonyms for, I can see them within my container. They're visible inside my container. And now I can do things like I can do open data, and I can browse those tables from inside my container. I have select access to those tables from within the scope of my container. I could write SQL code, stored procedures, whatever I wanted against these tables, even though they're over in the ERP schema, right? But let's go a step further. Part of the power of pulling these into my project is now I can create views on top of them, right? I can create calculation views or SQL views, and whatever I want to do with them, I could do. So let's create a database artifact here. Let's create a separate folder, Sflight. Oops. And what do we want to call this? Sflight view, and this is we're going to create an SQL view. There we are, and I've got the syntax for this already prepared. 13D. Once again, we're going to use a SQL DDL view. So just building a view, and here we don't have associations, because this is coming from an existing ERP schema managed by the ABAP layer, the ABAP data dictionary. So of course there's no HANA specific concepts here like associations. So we'll define the join criteria. We're just going to do a left outer join. We have to give it the criteria, but we could combine this together with HANA specific features. Like I could have added a structured privilege check here, just like we had done in the previous exercise. In fact, we'll do that here now. We'll create one without the HANA specific security, but then let's just create another one here. Another database artifact. We'll call this one Sflight ext. And this is a SQL view, and let's come over here and grab the syntax here, and what we were doing is we're actually going to layer these views on top of each other. So I took this view with the definition of the join, and now I'm going to layer a view on top of it as select from Sflight view. And this is going to be my external view. I'm not going to expose this lower level view with all the definition to the outside world. I'm only going to expose this consumption view, if you will, to the outside. And that way I have once again, almost like an API layer for my views. This is something you can apply with SQL DDL views or calculation views. And this is not a new concept. Many people do this even in the old repository with the HANA Studio. They create layers of their views, sort of to have a private and public interface to your views. And it's at this level that I'll supply the structured privilege check to add column level security to the view. Now, just like we saw earlier, now that we have a structured privilege check, we're going to have to extend our security just like we did in the previous exercise. So let's come to the roles folder, and let's add a new structured privilege for Sflight. Sflight priv, structured privilege, and got the syntax for this as well. 14. Take the structured privilege. Once again, we're going to hard code a value, but like I showed you at the end of the previous exercise, we really should pull that from the user profile or some other dynamic way of getting the value for this. I showed you even the example of where we would get that value, but we're not quite ready to talk about the XSA roles and where we would get that value from and how we inject it. That'll come a little bit later. So right now, for educational purposes, we'll go ahead and hard code the value here so that we only see client 001. And then, of course, we're going to need to adjust the admin role. This is already assigned to our technical users. We don't have to go through the whole assignment process and everything again. We can just change the role and add this privilege to it. So flight view privilege. That's the name of the privilege that we gave here. Actually, just to make sure that I don't introduce a typo, let's cut and paste that rather than type it. Okay, good. I didn't have a typo. But just to be safe there. And now when we build the whole project again, let's do this, build the database module again. This time we're going to create our two views. We're going to add the new structured privilege, and it will be added to the existing role that's already assigned to our technical user. So we're going to be able to select from that view right away. All right, so that's done. And if I come back over here to the Database Explorer and we look at our views, now we have, in addition to our purchase order views from the previous exercise, we've got our Sflight views. Of course, the technical user is going to be able to read this inner view, the Sflight view, but we wouldn't necessarily have to expose that to our external database user. Notice it's got client 300 data. It's got all the client data. It doesn't just have 300. But notice the very first couple of records are 300. But now when we look at our external view, which is going to have the analytic privilege, or the structured privilege on it, so it's going to get the automatic filtering. When we do open data, we only see client 001, which has a much smaller data set in it, only 12 rows. So now we've seen how we can access an external schema, a traditional ABAP managed data dictionary schema, so a BW, an ERP, a CRM schema. We've used Sflight to simulate that. We've seen how we do the setup to connect to that schema, how we grant access to our technical users so that they can access that schema, and then finally how we can then pull artifacts, tables, or reviews from that external schema into our local project development objects. In this case, we just created a SQL view. It could also be a calculation view. We'll do some of that later as well, and even apply HANA specific level security to these views. Obviously, once we're accessing the views directly, we're no longer going through the ABAP layer and the ABAP authorization objects, but we can apply HANA specific security. So like our external reporting users using reporting tools can access this view and get the automatic security applied to them.